Imagine a man imprisoned for his faith, condemned to a cruel fate, being boiled in hot oil. But did this really happen? Or is it just one of the many stories that formed around some of the Bible's most influential figures? In this video, we'll dive deep into the story of the Apostle John, examining what we truly know about his fate and how myths and truths have blended over the centuries. Get ready to question your own beliefs and uncover what historical records have to say about this mystery. Shall we seek the truth together? John, the last surviving member of the original 12 apostles, was one of the few who still carried the direct echo of Jesus' teachings in his voice. He personally witnessed the crucifixion and resurrection, and his mission over the years was to strengthen early Christian communities and keep the message of the gospel alive. John was not just a religious leader. He represented a bridge between the generation that knew Jesus and a new generation of Christians who were converting without ever having seen or heard Christ himself. This factor was crucial to his importance, as it gave him a legitimate and unquestionable authority, especially at a time when the Christian faith was beginning to expand beyond Jerusalem's borders, reaching diverse lands and cultures. This transition to a new generation of Christians brought challenges to doctrine and unity, as different interpretations and practices emerged in each community. As an eyewitness to the most significant events in Christianity, John played an essential role in preserving doctrine and orthodoxy. His presence was not only spiritual but also political within the Christian community, as he helped resolve conflicts, correct doctrinal deviations, and strengthen what could have become a fragmented tradition. In a period marked by oral tradition and the spread of messages through preaching and letters, John was one of the few able to ensure that Christianity did not become a series of scattered beliefs but rather a cohesive and consistent movement. At the same time, John's very survival amid Roman persecution added an aura of invulnerability to his figure. Among early Christians, he was known as the beloved disciple, a designation that granted him a special status and, in the eyes of many, a kind of divine protection. The fact that he continued to endure even during times of persecution reinforced the belief that God was preserving him for a special mission. This kind of devotion and respect meant that any attempt to punish or silence him was viewed cautiously by the Romans, as his execution could transform into a powerful source of inspiration for the faithful. John's figure was particularly threatening to the Roman Empire, which at that time faced complex challenges on its borders and internally. Ruled by Emperor Domitian, who saw Christianity as a threat to the empire's political and religious unity, Rome was unwilling to tolerate any movement that undermined imperial authority. Domitian demanded total loyalty from his subjects, including worship of the emperor, which contrasted deeply with the exclusivity of Christian worship that did not permit the veneration of other gods, let alone the divinity of a mortal ruler. In Roman eyes, refusing emperor worship was not merely an act of disobedience. It was a direct attack on the empire's stability and the emperor's power. Additionally, Christianity represented a rapidly growing subculture that attracted people from diverse backgrounds and social classes, often offering a network of support and solidarity that the Roman system could not or did not want to provide. This kind of united and self-sufficient community was viewed suspiciously by Rome. It was not just a new faith. It was a new way of life and relating to one another that confronted the status quo, challenging Roman customs and values. Within this context, prominent Christian leaders like John were seen not only as spiritual leaders, but as political threats that needed to be contained. The Roman approach to handling such threats varied. In some cases, the execution of leaders was preferred, making them examples of what happened to those who opposed imperial power. In others, the Romans opted for exile, a way of neutralizing these leaders' influence without necessarily creating martyrs who could further strengthen Christian resistance. In John's case, exile to the island of Patmos seems to have been a strategic decision. Separating him from his community and isolating him on a distant island was a way of limiting his influence without granting him the prestige of martyrdom, something that the early church valued greatly. The tradition that John was boiled in oil before being exiled might be seen as a way of adding an element of overcoming and spiritual triumph to his figure. However, despite the lack of direct historical records on this alleged martyrdom attempt, the legend persisted. For many Christians of that time, these stories of martyrdoms and tortures were not merely chronicles of suffering but vivid representations of God's power to protect and sustain his servants. Even without official documents verifying these events, the oral tradition and the devotion of John's followers helped keep this narrative alive. John's resistance to martyrdom became a powerful testimony of faith, a reminder that, despite trials and threats, God remains by the side of those who serve him. It's interesting to note that, for early Christians, the value of John's story of being boiled in oil did not lie so much in its literal truth, but in the symbolism of a faith that endures even under fire and torture. This type of uplifting narrative was common in Christian tradition and served as a source of inspiration and strength for believers. Stories of martyrdom like this provided examples of courage and fidelity that sustained Christians' faith during uncertain and persecuted times. To them, John's story was not only a tale of physical endurance, but also a testimony of unshakable faith, something many Christians aspired to. In this sense, the legend of John being boiled in oil helps illustrate how, for early Christians, martyrdom was seen as a seal of authenticity and devotion. Those who suffered for their faith not only strengthened their own belief but also inspired others to stand firm in the face of difficulties. To better understand the truth of John's story of being boiled in oil, we need to examine the historical sources that mention this episode. The earliest accounts of John's alleged martyrdom come primarily from early church writings, especially from authors like Tertullian. Known as one of the earliest Christian theologians and apologists, Tertullian lived between the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, about 100 years after John's time and his period of persecution. In his writings, he mentions that John was thrown into boiling oil in Rome but miraculously survived. However, as many scholars point out, Tertullian was not documenting a contemporary event but rather recording stories that were already circulating within the Christian tradition of his time. Tertullian wrote extensively to defend the Christian faith against Roman accusations, often using examples of martyrdom to demonstrate the perseverance and strength of Christians. This context leads us to question to what extent Tertullian was conveying an accurate historical account or simply reinforcing Christians' faith with an inspiring story. It's important to remember that, in the absence of official and detailed documents, Tertullian and other theologians of the time relied on oral accounts and traditions widely accepted by Christian communities. Another noteworthy point is the absence of Roman records corroborating the event. The Roman administration, though not always meticulous, was known for documenting some aspects of its punishments and executions, especially when it came to dissidents considered threats to imperial power. If John, a prominent figure, had been publicly tortured in Rome, it would be expected that some record, even an indirect one, would have survived. The lack of documentary evidence about this episode raises doubts about its veracity. Additionally, it's important to remember that Christianity at the time was still a growing and, in many respects, marginalized religion. It wasn't always considered significant enough to warrant official records. Besides Tertullian, other Christian writers from the early centuries also reference John, but rarely do we find direct mentions of the boiling oil episode. Eusebius of Caesarea, known as the father of church history, does not mention John's martyrdom in his writings. Eusebius dedicated himself to compiling a detailed history of early Christians and martyrdoms, using sources available and respected at the time. His omission of such a dramatic event suggests that this story may have been a later addition or perhaps a legend that gained strength in specific communities. Another relevant point is that, in Christian tradition, John is often described as the only apostle who did not die a martyr. According to some traditions, he lived to an old age and died of natural causes. This view of John as the disciple who survived is fundamental to his image in the early church, as it sets him apart from the other apostles who were persecuted and executed for their faith. Thus, the story of the boiling oil may have arisen as an attempt to associate John with the suffering and resilience that characterized the early martyrs, even if he did not face formal execution. On the other hand, the idea of John as a survivor of an execution attempt is fascinating from a symbolic perspective. If we consider the possibility that this story was a theological construction, it makes sense within the narrative of John as someone preserved by God for a special mission. By surviving a martyrdom attempt, John would not only strengthen his connection to Christ, but also serve as proof of God's power to sustain his followers amid extreme persecution. This story, then, might be less about the historical fact itself and more about the symbolism of unbreakable faith. Beyond Tertullian and Eusebius, other early Christian writers mention John, but none offer clear confirmation of the event in Rome. This lack of independent and reliable testimonies raises the possibility that the boiling oil episode may have been an oral tradition passed down from generation to generation and eventually incorporated into the collective memory of Christians. For a community accustomed to stories of resistance and martyrdom, this narrative was inspiring and reinforced the belief that, even in situations of extreme torture, divine protection could intervene. Early Christians often relied on stories of miracles and divine interventions to legitimize their faith and to endure in times of persecution. These stories often provided comfort and encouragement, helping to strengthen Christian identity. In an era when the community's survival depended as much on spiritual strength as on internal cohesion, stories like John's boiling oil ordeal served as reminders of God's power and his faithfulness to his followers. The spread of John's boiling oil story also reflects the role that legends and traditions played in the oral culture of early Christians. Often, these stories were transmitted through sermons, poems, and even theatrical representations that inspired the audience. This was a way to teach, inspire, and keep the community united around examples of unwavering faith. Legends about the martyrdom of apostles and saints helped create a mythology around Christian faith, one that reinforced values of courage and faithfulness. John, as a central and inspiring figure, would naturally become the protagonist of one of these narratives. Over time, John's boiling oil story may have been reinforced by second- or third-hand accounts, taking on the air of truth as it was repeated in different communities. This tradition likely spread among Christians, reaching different regions and groups, and eventually became accepted as a faith truth. The possibility that the narrative was amplified by devotion and the need for inspiring examples shows how legends can grow during times of persecution, offering hope and strength amid difficulties. The absence of a direct account and the lack of more consistent mentions in sources from the time indicate that John's boiling oil story is likely a legend created to reinforce the image of one of early Christianity's main leaders. However, its spiritual and inspiring impact remained alive through the centuries, showing how, for Christians, the power of an example of faith and resilience transcended historical accuracy. Understanding the origin and spread of John's boiling oil story involves exploring how legends and traditions formed and spread within early Christian communities. These communities, often isolated and facing persecution, saw in John's figure not just a spiritual leader, but also a symbol of perseverance and resilience. The myth of the boiling oil is a classic example of how uplifting and inspiring stories could gain strength, even without historical confirmation, becoming an integral part of Christian identity and narrative. In ancient cultures, the transmission of stories and traditions occurred primarily orally, facilitating the adaptation and amplification of accounts over time. Given the hostile environment in which early Christians lived, it's understandable that these stories took on a heroic tone, with elements of miraculous resistance. The martyrdom and miraculous survival of John were likely narrated and retold to reinforce the faith of those facing similar circumstances. In a setting where fear and uncertainty permeated Christians' lives, stories of triumph over suffering helped create a sense of divine security and protection. This type of legend may have spread in various ways. Itinerant preachers and spiritual leaders traveled between communities, sharing stories and teachings. At each stop, storytellers would add elements, interpret details differently, or emphasize specific aspects according to the local community's needs. Thus, a narrative could gain new details and adaptations over its journey, enriching the original story with each new listener. The legend of John in boiling oil, transmitted and amplified, became a symbol of faith, fostering belief in divine protection and reinforcing spiritual resilience. It's important to remember that, in Christian tradition, miracles and supernatural interventions played a central role in how early followers of Jesus understood their own faith and relationship with God. For these Christians, the idea that John could have survived brutal torture, like immersion in boiling oil, wasn't unacceptable. Rather, it was perfectly compatible with the belief that God worked miracles for those he chose. These accounts of miraculous survival were not just martyrdom stories, but also evidence of God's power to protect his followers, inspiring them to stand firm in their faith. The absence of Roman sources or documentary evidence of this specific event may also have contributed to the legend's emergence. Without official records to confirm or refute the account, the Christian community was free to interpret and expand the story according to their spiritual beliefs and needs. For many Christians of the time, the lack of material evidence didn't lessen the story's truthfulness. On the contrary, it reinforced the idea that faith transcended physical reality. In this sense, the story of John in boiling oil may have been seen as a sign that God operated in dimensions beyond what was tangible or documentable. Another important factor in the spread of the myth was the need to create exemplary and inspiring figures. In the absence of formal catechesis or written doctrine, stories of faith and resilience were the primary means of transmitting Christian values and principles. Spiritual leaders used these stories to teach virtues and encourage the faithful to stand firm in adversity. The story of John in boiling oil, with its element of miraculous survival, offered a powerful example of courage, faith, and divine protection, qualities that Christian communities needed in times of persecution. Additionally, legends about the martyrdom of significant figures like John helped create a shared mythology that united Christians around common values and symbols. In a context of cultural and geographical diversity, these stories contributed to establishing a collective and cohesive identity. John, surviving the boiling oil, represented the victory of faith over fear and death, embodying the resilience that Christians aspired to. By sharing these narratives, early Christians cultivated a sense of belonging and communion, essential for strengthening their community. The legend of John in boiling oil may have gained strength over time because, for many Christians, it fulfilled a deep spiritual need. Amid difficulties and suffering, stories like this offered a sense of hope, a reminder that God was faithful and present, even in the most adverse circumstances. To understand the impact of John's boiling oil story, we must consider the role of myths and legends in building Christian tradition. In times of persecution, stories of miracles and martyrdom became powerful tools for spiritual strengthening. Early Christians saw in these stories not just accounts of suffering, but also a source of inspiration and hope, essential elements for maintaining their faith in a hostile environment. The myth of John in boiling oil, like other martyrdom legends, functioned as a symbol of spiritual victory, transcending physical limitations and affirming divine presence amid suffering. These legends, far from being mere inventions, served a pedagogical and spiritual function in Christian tradition. They offered a tangible example of how Christ's followers should face persecution and death, with courage and unwavering faith. For many, John's story was not just an extraordinary account. It was a model to be followed. Christians of that time saw martyrs and figures like John as a kind of heroes of faith, whose lives inspired the faithful to persevere. In this way, legends helped build a collective identity in which earthly challenges were seen as opportunities to glorify God. Moreover, these miraculous narratives reinforced the belief in an active and protective God who cared for his faithful until the last moment. By recounting that John survived torture such as immersion in boiling oil, Christians were not only reaffirming the strength of faith, but also God's power to intervene in extreme situations. This type of miracle, often associated with martyrdom, served as a reminder that, even amid suffering, God's presence was a living reality. The legends, then, not only strengthened individual faith but also united the community around a common narrative that transcended mere historical aspects. The legends about martyrs also helped fulfill the human need to give meaning to suffering. In an era marked by violence and uncertainty, Christians needed a spiritual interpretation of their trials. Martyrdom stories like John's offered a theological and moral context that justified suffering, transforming it into a form of testimony. This concept of redemptive suffering was central to early Christian spirituality and continued to shape faith throughout the centuries. Another function of myths and legends in Christian tradition was reinforcing fundamental values and teachings of the faith. In the absence of a formal doctrinal structure and the complete Bible as we know it today, stories of martyrs and inspiring figures like John were used as educational tools. They served to teach values such as courage, loyalty to God, and perseverance in the face of adversity. The story of John surviving the boiling oil conveyed, in a practical and emotional way, the idea that God protects his faithful, even in the most extreme circumstances. These legends also played a unifying role within the cultural and ethnic diversity of the early Christian communities. Christianity quickly spread throughout the Roman Empire, reaching different peoples and traditions. Inspiring stories like John's helped create a shared foundation of faith and values for Christians of all backgrounds, facilitating the establishment of a universal Christian identity. This shared identity was crucial for strengthening the Christian community in a hostile world, where survival depended not only on individual faith but also on community cohesion. Another important aspect of martyrdom legends was their role in legitimizing church leaders and apostles. The story of John boiled in oil, for example, reinforced his position as a spiritual leader of great importance, someone who not only preached the gospel but also suffered for it. In a time when the Christian faith was constantly challenged, the story of a leader who endured mortal torture symbolized the authenticity of his message and authority. The legends, therefore, helped consolidate the legitimacy of Christianity's central figures and strengthen the structure of the emerging church. Christian legends about martyrdom, such as John's, carried a legacy of inspiration that echoes to this day. Even if their veracity is questioned, the symbolic power of these stories remains. They remind Christians of the capacity to endure suffering with dignity and to find purpose in faith, regardless of circumstances. The Christian tradition, rich in accounts of courage and endurance, found in myths and legends a way to eternalize values that continue to inspire generations. The story of John boiled in oil stands out among the apostolic martyrdom accounts, but it is not the only narrative of sacrifice and suffering in early Christian tradition. Comparing it with other martyrdom stories reveals similar patterns of resilience and faith, helping us understand the context in which these narratives arose and were amplified. Each of the apostles faced unique challenges, but ultimately, many of them met with extreme suffering and execution, symbolizing the strength of their faith and commitment to Christ's message. Studying these stories allows us to see how martyrdom was shaped to inspire the faithful, even though not all accounts are historically verifiable. One of the most well-known accounts is that of Peter, who, according to tradition, was crucified in Rome during Emperor Nero's persecution. It is said that Peter requested to be crucified upside down, deeming himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. This detail of his execution, though undocumented historically, gained a strong presence in Christian tradition and became a symbol of humility and devotion. Peter's martyrdom story, like John's, served to demonstrate that faith transcends the fear of death and inspires fidelity to the end. These narratives help define the ideal Christian profile, someone who, in the face of suffering, chooses loyalty to God. Paul's case is another example illustrating the power of martyrdom accounts in Christian tradition. Though Paul was not one of the original 12 apostles, his conversion and dedication to Christianity made him one of the most influential figures in the early church. According to tradition, Paul was beheaded in Rome, a form of execution reserved for Roman citizens. Like the accounts of John and Peter, Paul's story reinforces the theme of endurance and sacrifice in the name of faith. Although there are few official records of his death, Christian tradition preserved his martyrdom narrative as a testimony of courage and total surrender. These martyrdom stories, including John's, are not just accounts of suffering. They offer Christians examples of unwavering faith. They were especially significant for early Christians who faced continuous persecution and needed models to follow. John's story of surviving boiling oil, in comparison with the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, stands out for the miraculous survival of the apostle, an element that reinforces the idea of divine protection. By surviving such cruel torture, John would have become a living proof of God's power to preserve those he chooses for a special mission. It is interesting to note that while John is portrayed as surviving an act of torture, other apostles are depicted as accepting death without resistance, creating a distinction between his mission and that of his companions. John, often seen as the beloved disciple and the author of Revelation, represents the continuity of Jesus' message until the end of his life. John's survival may thus symbolize the preservation of divine revelation until Christ's second coming, while the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul emphasize the willingness for immediate sacrifice in the name of faith. This distinction gives John's account a special appeal, as it combines martyrdom with survival, making him a figure of hope and ongoing resilience. In addition to the apostles, many other prominent figures in the early church were venerated for their acts of martyrdom. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was stoned to death for defending his faith. His story, narrated in the book of Acts, established a pattern for martyrdom accounts. The faithful person who, in the face of persecution, does not renounce his faith and faces death with serenity. Like the accounts of John, Peter, and Paul, Stephen's story reinforces the idea that Christian faith brings with it a call to fidelity that often demands the ultimate sacrifice. Martyrdom legends also extend to other figures in Christian tradition, such as Ignatius of Antioch, who was taken to Rome and condemned to be devoured by lions in the Colosseum. His willingness to accept death joyfully and his desire to be ground by the teeth of beast, to be closer to Christ, as he himself wrote, highlights the intensity of early Christians' commitment to their faith. These accounts, though they may seem extreme to modern minds, served to motivate and inspire communities living under constant threat. The story of John in boiling oil, when placed alongside other martyrdom accounts, gains even more strength as part of a tradition of endurance and faith that marked the early church. These stories also had a symbolic purpose, helping to establish Christianity's core values and create a communal identity. For early Christians, these narratives were a way of affirming that faith in Christ surpassed even the most terrible forces the world could offer. In an environment where death was a constant threat, martyrdom accounts were a source of comfort and courage, reminding the faithful that, even in death, they remained victorious in Christ. The story of John in boiling oil can be understood as part of a broader tradition of martyrdom accounts, in which Christian faith is portrayed as unbreakable in the face of suffering. These accounts, while often historically questionable, serve to strengthen the Christian community, offering examples of fidelity that transcended the fear of death. John's case, in particular, with his miraculous survival, reinforces the idea that God protects and preserves his chosen ones. This narrative, alongside the stories of Peter, Paul, Stephen, and other martyrs, creates a vision of Christianity as a faith that overcomes adversity and finds meaning and purpose even in persecution. The story of John in boiling oil, with its symbolism of survival and unwavering faith, was more than an inspiring narrative. It became a spiritual reference point for early Christians and for subsequent generations. It represents the strength of a faith that endures even in the face of the greatest trials, serving as a reminder that God's presence can be felt even in circumstances of intense suffering. The influence of this story went beyond the limits of oral tradition. It was integrated into Christian spirituality, shaping how Christians viewed themselves and their relationship with God. One of the primary impacts of this story on Christian spirituality was the notion of faith tested by fire. This concept, which appears in several biblical passages, represents the idea that faith, to be genuine, must be tested and strengthened through hardships. John, supposedly immersed in boiling oil and surviving, became a symbol of this tested and approved faith. The image of fire, in John's case, is both literal and metaphorical, encapsulating the experience of physical suffering and the spiritual purification that accompanies endurance. For Christians facing persecution, this type of story offered an understanding of their own suffering as something purposeful and meaningful. John's survival, interpreted as an act of divine intervention, reinforced the idea that God never abandons his followers, even in situations of extreme despair. Thus, John became a model of trust in divine protection, even in seemingly unbearable circumstances. This aspect of the story helped shape a spirituality that encouraged Christians to face their hardships with serenity and to see suffering as an opportunity to deepen their faith. Furthermore, the narrative of John being boiled in oil influenced how Christians began to understand the role of martyrdom and suffering in their spiritual journey. Martyrdom was elevated to a supreme form of testimony to Christian faith, and John, by surviving torture, offered an alternative version of this testimony. Someone who suffers but is spared by God to continue his mission. In a sense, this survival increased his significance as a living witness to Jesus' teachings. At the same time, it set John apart from the other apostles, whose deaths were seen as a final expression of their commitment to Christ. John's survival symbolized the continuity of Christ's message until his second coming, connecting earthly life with the promise of eternal life. The legend of John being boiled in oil also inspired a deeper understanding of spiritual resilience. The idea of enduring suffering without succumbing to despair is a central theme in Christian spirituality, and John's story exemplifies this powerfully. For Christians, this legend was proof that, even in the face of forces seeking to destroy faith, the human spirit, with God's help, can remain unshakable. This concept of resilience influenced generations of Christians, inspiring them to endure hardships with confidence that God would strengthen them. In Christian mysticism, especially among early ascetics and hermits, John's story also took on a deeper symbolic meaning. Many sought a life of retreat and contemplation, where physical and spiritual trials were seen as means of purification and closeness to God. John's survival in the boiling oil was interpreted by some as a symbol that the true follower of Christ must be prepared to endure to the fire, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, to achieve a purer and truer faith. This view influenced ascetic practices, where endurance of suffering was valued as a demonstration of devotion and a pursuit of holiness. In a broader sense, John's survival shaped the Christian view that God has the power to intervene and transform desperate situations into testimonies of faith. This belief manifests in the hope that, regardless of difficulties, God is always present, capable of turning suffering into something meaningful and spiritually enriching. This confidence in divine intervention permeates Christian spirituality and continues to inspire the practice of prayer, trust, and surrender to God in moments of distress. For Christians, the story of John in boiling oil symbolized the promise that, even in the darkest situations, God's grace is sufficient to sustain and protect. The influence of this story can also be seen in Christian art and literature throughout the centuries. Many icons, stained glass windows, and paintings depict John in ways that emphasize his resilience and connection to the divine. The image of John in boiling oil, though shocking, became an artistic representation of faith that overcomes suffering. These representations were not merely works of art. They served as visual reminders of the promise of divine protection. In an era when most people were illiterate, these images were essential for conveying the stories and values of the Christian faith. In short, the story of John being boiled in oil became an enduring source of spiritual inspiration, a reminder that faith in God can sustain people even through the severest trials. The story of John in boiling oil, like other legends and traditions of the Christian faith, invites us to reflect on the value of questioning and historical investigation in understanding these narratives. In ancient times, when sources of information were limited and faith was predominantly passed down orally, miraculous stories and martyrdom accounts became a fundamental part of Christian tradition. However, examining these stories in light of new historical and archaeological methods offers us a more complex and, at the same time, enriching perspective on the beliefs that shaped Christian spirituality. Questioning the historical accuracy of religious traditions, like that of John in boiling oil, does not diminish their spiritual value. Instead, it allows for a deeper understanding of the faith and the cultural elements that influenced how these stories were preserved. For many, these narratives are symbolic ways of conveying eternal values, such as courage, loyalty, and divine protection. Critically analyzing these stories helps us distinguish between the spiritual essence they convey and the literal details that may have been adapted or amplified over the centuries. By investigating the development of religious traditions, we understand that early Christianity was deeply connected to the cultural and social context of its time. Persecution was a reality for many Christians, and miracle and martyrdom stories, like John's, reflected the need for resilience and hope. The act of investigating these accounts is an opportunity to observe how Christian faith evolved in response to the spiritual and cultural needs of its followers. Understanding this process helps us appreciate the spiritual resilience of early Christians while recognizing the role of symbolic narratives in shaping religious identity. Furthermore, critically analyzing accounts like that of John in boiling oil contributes to a more conscious and mature faith. When contemporary Christians investigate the history of their faith, they are encouraged to embrace a spirituality that acknowledges both the symbolic depth and historical significance of traditions. This process of questioning and seeking the truth does not weaken faith. Rather, it enriches it, providing space for more authentic reflections connected to human realities. Examining John's story and other Christian legends strengthens spirituality by understanding the contexts that shaped these narratives. Another benefit of questioning traditions is developing a more critical and respectful view of different interpretations within Christianity. Many Christian denominations and communities approach these stories uniquely, and investigating these interpretive differences allows us to appreciate the diversity of Christian faith. Recognizing that some legends have been interpreted in various ways over time enables Christians to appreciate the richness and plurality of their own tradition. Questioning is not rejection but an expansion of understanding how faith can be lived and experienced in diverse and multifaceted ways. Moreover, questioning religious traditions opens doors to other disciplines, such as history, archaeology, and anthropology. These areas provide tools for a broader and deeper analysis of biblical narratives, sacred figures, and events that marked the early church. For example, the story of John in boiling oil gains new dimensions when studied within the context of Roman Empire practices and beliefs, where martyrdom stories were used to reinforce the empire's power over its enemies, while Christians reversed this narrative into something that spiritually strengthened them. Questioning and investigating religious traditions also allows each generation to reinterpret faith in ways that make sense for its time. Christian tradition is alive, shaped by interaction with different eras, cultures, and challenges. The story of John in boiling oil may have different meanings today than it did in the early centuries. Critically reflecting on these stories enables contemporary Christians to find new ways to apply the values and teachings of their faith in a constantly changing world. The narrative of John, even with its historical uncertainties, leaves a profound legacy in Christian spirituality, symbolizing the resilience of faith in the face of adversity and divine intervention, which, for many, remains present to this day. Through examining this story and comparing it with other martyrdom accounts, we can appreciate not only the courage of early Christians but also how these legends helped shape Christian identity over the centuries. John's story, with his miraculous survival, stands as a symbol of resilience and hope. For early Christians, it offered a vision of a God who does not abandon his followers, even in the most extreme situations. For contemporary Christians, this narrative serves as a reminder of faith's power to transcend difficulties and inspire a life of dedication to God, regardless of circumstances. The spiritual resilience exemplified in John's figure invites us to view life's trials as opportunities for growth and closeness to the divine. This legend also reminds us of the value of stories in building collective identity and faith. Oral traditions passed down from generation to generation carry values and teachings that go beyond the literal details of events. Even if the story of John in boiling oil cannot be historically verified, its spiritual significance endures, teaching lessons of courage, perseverance, and trust in divine protection. These stories, even wrapped in myths, carry spiritual truths that have shaped the faith of millions over the centuries. This study reveals that questioning and investigating religious traditions do not weaken faith but enrich it. By seeking to understand the context and purpose of these narratives, Christians approach a more mature and meaningful understanding of their spirituality. The story of John in boiling oil, analyzed through the lenses of history, theology, and symbolism, offers a broader view of what it means to live a life of faith in God. This journey of investigation into John's story and other Christian legends is an opportunity to rekindle the connection with the fundamental teachings of faith, applying them in a modern world where perseverance, faith, and courage are as necessary as they were in ancient times. We conclude with the reflection that, although historical details may be uncertain, the spiritual impact and symbolism of these stories remain powerful and relevant, inspiring us to face our challenges with the same faith that sustained the early Christians. I invite you to share your own thoughts and insights on this story. What do you think the account of John being boiled in oil represents? Do you believe that these legends hold enduring spiritual value, even when their historical accuracy is questioned? Leave your comment and share your opinion. Your voice is essential to the dialogue and deepening of this topic, and your reflections may inspire others to view these stories from new perspectives. If you're interested in learning more about the myths and truths of biblical history and the stories and figures that have shaped Christian spirituality over the centuries, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're preparing more fascinating content that will explore the true meanings of other biblical accounts and the messages they hold for contemporary life. This is an ongoing journey of knowledge and faith, and each episode is an opportunity to delve into the most profound and transformative aspects of Christianity. Together, we can explore history and rediscover the lessons the early Christians left us, applying them in practical and inspiring ways to the challenges and spirituality of today's world. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.